Hi, I'm Old Norse specialist Dr. Jackson Crawford, and today on my channel I'm going to be covering the 5 biggest misconceptions that people have about the runes. Number 1. Vikings were covered in rune tattoos. The truth is, probably not. We don't have a lot of support for the notion that Vikings had tattoos at all. The main source that suggests that they might have is the travel account by the Arabic writer Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who in 922 witnessed a funeral by a people he called the Rus. This was a common name in Eastern Europe for Swedish Vikings. And he stated that they were, and here I am quoting from a modern translation, he said that they were covered from the tips of from their necks to the tips of their toes in dark green tattoos. Now, I'm an Old Norse specialist, not an Arabic specialist. I don't understand the niceties of Arabic, but I understand that the word used for tattoos there could also mean paint. Now, it's also hard to make a generalization from one observation of a Scandinavian language people, possibly, of course we don't even know what language the people he encountered were speaking, on the margins of their world. We just don't have the archaeological evidence or anything in the Eddas or saugus written by the Norse themselves that suggests that they were using tattoos. Now, of course, today, one of the problems we get in studying Vikings is that they're so popular now that everybody wants to kind of project what they like and what their fashions are, and they want to kind of justify them by reference to the Vikings. And since tattoos are so popular right now in the late 2010s, people want the Vikings to be tattooed. But just like in the 70s, you have Vikings with big hair and big bushy mustaches. Today, the Vikings we're presenting have tattoos, and it really has more to do with what our fashion is than what their fashion probably was. Misconception number 2. Old Norse was written using the elder futhark alphabet of runes. It was not. It was in fact written using the younger futhark alphabet. Now, these two alphabets are pretty easily distinguished right away. Elder futhark has 24 rune letters. Younger futhark has 16. And what's happened is people get mixed up about the timeline, about the context, because of course Old Norse, Elder futhark, they both sound old, but from different perspectives, the 1970s might be old, 2010 might be old, 4.5 billion years ago might be old, right? So what does old and elder mean? Well, Elder futhark is named that to distinguish it from Younger futhark. Elder futhark, we have our earliest written remains of that from about 150, 160 AD. It was probably in use much earlier than that. But then Younger futhark we have beginning around AD 700, although there's a transitional century or so in there where you get kind of mixed forms in Scandinavia. Old Norse is our name for the language beginning right around 700, right around when the Younger futhark alphabet is coming into use. Before that, we would call the language in Scandinavia Proto-Norse or even Proto-Germanic in the earliest centuries of Elder futhark. This would in fact be a language very similar to the ancestor of not just the Scandinavian languages, but also of English, German, and other modern Germanic languages. Now, this is part of what causes confusion when people try to write Old Norse and Elder futhark. It's actually quite difficult because there are many vowel sounds that Elder futhark has no way of representing. Now, Younger futhark isn't very efficient at representing them, but there are at least implicit rules or guidelines to how they're represented by the few vowel letters that there are. So Elder futhark belongs to an older stage than the Old Norse language. The Old Norse language was in fact written using the Younger futhark, and of course later the Roman alphabet, which brings me to misconception number 3, that works such as the Eddas and saugus were written in runes. They were not. In fact, we have very few long texts in runes. I believe that the longest is actually, in terms of stone, is the Rök runestone. Now, there are some manuscripts written in ink with runes. The only long one that is preserved is called the Codex Runicus. This is from about 1300. It is from Skåne, and it contains the laws of Skåne as well as, famously, the first bit of music written in Scandinavia. with musical notation. But once the Roman alphabet was introduced along with Christianity, the only long texts were written in the Roman alphabet. Runes were left for writing on different mediums, and this probably has to do with just tradition, right? It's a tradition that stone or leather or bark is carved with runes. It's a tradition brought with the teaching of how to write in ink on parchment or vellum that you write in the Roman alphabet. And so by the simple force of tradition, once writing is done with ink, it is done with the Roman alphabet. There's probably not a symbolic importance to that. It probably simply has to do with the force of tradition, the impetus, the inertia, excuse me, of cultural factors, including the inertia that ink goes with the Roman alphabet, not with runes. Big misconception number 2, runes were symbols rather than letters. Primarily, runes were letters and an alphabet, right? Any given inscription that you find, almost always the runes that you see are representing sounds, just like A, B, C, D represent sounds in English or other languages today, or indeed in Old Norse in the Roman alphabet. Occasionally, yes, there are times when a given inscription cannot be decoded that way, where we are not quite clear on why given symbols are repeated, or given letters go together in ways that don't seem to spell words. We're not really sure necessarily what's happening there, and it could represent symbolic uses of the runes, but we don't know what those symbolic meanings were. Now, we do have names for the runes. These are sourced from the rune poems. We have 2 for the Younger Futhark in Old Norse. Those are the Old Icelandic rune poem and the Old Norwegian rune poem. And we also have 1 for Old English, the Old English rune poem. From those, we can reconstruct the names of the runes in Elder Futhark as well. But just because these names mean something, for instance, the name of the first rune in Old Norse is Fe, and Old English is Feoch. In Proto-Germanic, the ancestor of both, in Elder Futhark, it was probably Fehu. Just because that means cattle or money doesn't mean necessarily that that letter was used to symbolize cattle or money. We don't understand necessarily the way that these would have been used as symbols because we have no guidebooks to explain this. There are not books from the time when runes were a major written form of communication that explain them. Everything that we know about them is inferred looking backwards. I also ought to mention in connection with that the symbols that are well known today, such as the ægishjálmur, come from later manuscripts, in fact, early modern manuscripts, not even medieval, and we are not certain what those mean, and they also are not runes, right? Ægishjálmur does not mean any kind of sound. We have other symbols, such as the so-called Valknutur, we actually don't know what it was called in Old Norse, that appear on some rune stones or picture stones from the Viking Age. We also don't know what those symbols meant to the people who carved them. A lot of modern interpretations aside, they are actually open questions as far as scholars are concerned. And the last misconception I'm going to cover today, number 5, is related. It is the misconception that the Christian Church suppressed runes. In fact, the Christian Church seems to have been fairly neutral toward them. The Christian Church, of course, introduced the Roman alphabet and writing with ink, and the Latin language for ecclesiastical purposes, but there does not seem to have been any sort of rush, any sort of cultural imperative to dump the runes, only to continue using them in the context that they had continued to be used in, and not to migrate them into new contexts, such as writing on parchment or vellum. In fact, most inscriptions in runes post-date the conversion to Christianity, so there are more rune stones you're going to find with crosses and explicitly Christian messages on them than you will that come from before Christianity, and especially more that have explicitly Christian messages than have explicitly pagan messages. Of course, there are explicitly pagan messages on some. In fact, we have the names of pagan gods attested in Younger Futhark and marginally in Elder Futhark. For instance, we have Thor and Odin and Tyr attested in Younger Futhark. We have at least Wothanas, the Proto-Germanic form of Othin, or something just a little bit removed from Proto-Germanic, attested in Elder Futhark. But there's not a whole lot of explicitly pagan material, at least not the way I understand, but there's a lot of explicitly Christian material. So the Christian church didn't suppress runes, it just didn't migrate them into new purposes, such as writing on parchment, or vellum, which is why you get most of our documents that are written in ink in Old Norse, written in the Roman alphabet, rather than in runes, with very few exceptions, such as the Codex Runicus. Well, I hope this has been an interesting or informative look at the misconceptions about runes that are out there, as well as some of the true facts about them. If you're interested in more about runes and other subjects related to Old Norse language and myth, I hope you'll check out other videos on my channel. I think there's 300 something on there. And I also am a translator of Norse myths and sagas. I've translated the poetic Edda, the main source of the Norse myths of gods such as Odin, Thor, and Loki. And I've translated the saga The Volsungs together with the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, and both of those are available as audiobooks narrated by me as well. And in the near future, in fall 2019, my translation of Havamal, accompanied by the Old Norse text with thorough commentary by me and a lot of extra notes and extra translations, will be available as well. That's the Wanderer's Havamal. Well, for now, from beautiful Colorado, let me wish you all the best.